She was 46 years old, and for 11 years she scrubbed floors in a house that was bigger than the church she grew up praying in, and not one person inside those walls ever bothered to learn her story. They called her the crazy maid behind her back, and sometimes to her face because of the small cloth pouch she kept tied to her apron, filled with dried leaves and roots that smelled like the dirt of a place none of them had ever been. They laughed at her in the kitchen. They rolled their eyes when she spoke. But in 11 days, that same woman would be kneeling beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of a dying young woman, doing the one thing that every doctor in that building had already given up trying to do. And what happened in that room would change the way an entire family understood the word worthless for the rest of their lives. Her name was Maggie Coleman, and before we go any further into how a woman nobody respected became the only person standing between a young woman and a funeral, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story only gets heavier from here, and you are going to want to see exactly how it ends. Maggie came from a small town in the hill country, the kind of place where the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away on a good day, and where grandmothers were the first call when a fever wouldn't break or a cough wouldn't quit. She grew up watching her own mother walk the fence lines at dawn, picking the same leaves that would later sit in that little cloth pouch on her apron. Nobody in that town called it strange. It was just how things were done when help was far away and money was scarce. Her father worked the local feed mill for 30 years, and her mother took in sewing on the side to cover what the mill paycheck couldn't stretch to. There were 6 children in that house, and Maggie was the second oldest, which meant she learned early how to stretch a dollar and how to read the small signs of illness before they became emergencies, because calling a doctor out to their part of the county wasn't a quick decision, it was a half-day's wage decision. By the time she was 12, she could identify a dozen different plants by smell alone, and she knew which ones eased a fever, which ones settled a stomach, and which ones her mother kept locked away entirely because, as her mother put it, the difference between medicine and poison was almost always just the amount. But the house Maggie worked in now belonged to a different world entirely, a world of marble floors and private physicians, and a man named Richard Holloway, who had built one of the largest logistics companies on the East Coast from a single delivery truck his father once owned, and who trusted exactly 2 things in this life: numbers and proof. Richard had taken over the company in his late 20s after his father's sudden death, inheriting a business that was barely profitable and a board of directors who expected him to fail within 2 years. He didn't fail. He spent the next 2 decades building it into a company that moved freight across 11 states, and somewhere in that climb, he had developed an almost religious devotion to data, to contracts, to anything that could be measured and verified. It made him an extraordinary businessman. It also made him the kind of father who, without meaning to, treated his own home like another operation to be optimized rather than a place to simply exist in. Richard Holloway had a daughter named Claire, 19 years old, sharp as a tack, and the only soft place left in a man who had spent the last decade burying himself in spreadsheets and board meetings. Claire was the one person in that enormous house who never once looked down on Maggie. She would sneak into the kitchen and ask about the pouch, about the leaves, about where Maggie had grown up, and Maggie would answer every question patiently, never knowing that one day those quiet kitchen conversations would matter more than anything else that happened inside those walls. Claire had grown up almost entirely under the care of household staff, because her mother had passed away when Claire was only 6, and Richard, drowning in grief and a business that demanded everything he had, leaned on nannies and tutors and eventually a rotating staff of housekeepers to fill the gap he couldn't fill himself. Claire didn't resent her father for it, not exactly, but she had learned not to expect him in the room for the things that mattered, the school plays, the late-night talks, the ordinary moments most kids take for granted. What she found instead, almost by accident, was Maggie. Maggie didn't have an agenda. Maggie didn't need anything from her. Maggie simply talked to her like a person, and over the 2 years Maggie had worked there, that quiet, unglamorous kindness had become something Claire genuinely depended on, even if she never said so out loud. The household staff thought it was cute, a rich man's daughter humoring the help. None of them understood that Claire was the only one paying attention. The cook, a sharp-tongued woman named Donna who had been with the family for nearly 15 years, made a habit of mocking Maggie's pouch in front of the other staff, calling it witch's brew within earshot of anyone who would laugh along. The head housekeeper, a stern woman who ran the household with the precision of a military officer, treated Maggie as replaceable, the kind of employee you didn't bother learning much about, because there would always be another one to take her place. Maggie absorbed all of it quietly because she needed the income, and because 11 years of practice had taught her that pushing back rarely changed anything. It usually just made things worse. For weeks before anything went wrong, there were small signs that nobody took seriously. Claire complained of being tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. A faint rash appeared on her arms and disappeared just as fast, dismissed as an allergy to a new detergent. She lost her appetite, picked at her food, and the household doctor, a man who visited twice a month and billed by the hour, waved it off as a typical phase young adults sometimes go through, stress from school, maybe a minor sensitivity to something in her diet. Nothing worth alarming her father over. Richard was 3,000 miles away closing a deal in Seattle during most of this, reachable only by an assistant who filtered every message before it reached him, trained over the years to handle anything that didn't look like a true emergency. Maggie noticed. Maggie always noticed. She watched Claire grow paler over the course of 2 weeks, watched her push food around her plate at dinner, watched the dark circles deepen under her eyes even as Claire insisted she was fine. But Maggie was the maid. And maids in that house did not offer medical opinions, especially not ones rooted in leaves and roots that the cook openly mocked in front of the rest of the staff. There was a moment, about 10 days before the collapse, when Maggie almost said something. She found Claire sitting alone in the garden, unusually quiet, and Maggie sat down beside her and asked gently if everything was all right. Claire brushed it off, said she was just tired from finals, and Maggie let it go, telling herself it wasn't her place to push. She thought about that moment often in the days that followed, replaying it, wondering what would have happened if she had said what she was actually thinking instead of staying silent. It was a small decision in the moment. It would feel like the heaviest decision of her life later. The night before everything fell apart, Maggie was called into the head housekeeper's office and accused of stealing a piece of jewelry that had simply been misplaced. She stood there and took the accusation in silence, the same way she had taken every small humiliation in that house for 11 years, because she needed the job, and she had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed anything. The housekeeper didn't ask a single question, didn't consider for a moment that the jewelry might simply have been misplaced, because in her mind, the maid was always the easiest explanation. She was told she was on her last warning, that one more incident, and she would be gone by the end of the month. She walked back to her small room above the garage that night carrying the full weight of being disposable, lying awake replaying 11 years of being underestimated, 11 years of being the person nobody in that house ever truly saw. She had no idea that less than 24 hours later, the only thing standing between Claire Holloway and death would be the very woman that house had just threatened to throw away. The next morning, Claire did not come down for breakfast. By noon she had collapsed in the hallway outside her bedroom, her lips pale, her breathing shallow and uneven, and the household erupted into the kind of controlled panic that money cannot prevent and money cannot fix fast enough. The same staff who had spent weeks dismissing the warning signs now scrambled in every direction, shouting for help, calling emergency services, completely unprepared for how fast things had turned. Paramedics arrived within minutes, moving with the kind of practiced urgency that comes from years of training, and within the hour Claire was in the back of an ambulance, an oxygen mask over her face, monitors beeping steadily beside her as the vehicle raced toward the city's largest hospital. Richard Holloway was on a plane back from Seattle before Claire even reached the hospital, his phone lighting up with messages he couldn't bring himself to read in order, each one worse than the last, the words collapsed, ambulance, and unresponsive jumping out at him from a screen he could barely focus on at 30,000 feet. By the time he landed, his daughter was already hooked to monitors in the intensive care unit, surrounded by a team of specialists who, for the first 6 hours, had absolutely no idea what was happening inside her body, and every test they ran came back with more questions than answers. Blood work showed inflammation markers nobody could explain. Her organ function was beginning to decline in a pattern none of the attending physicians had seen presented quite this way before. They ran scan after scan, test after test, ruling out one possibility after another, while Claire's condition continued, slowly and steadily, to worsen. Richard walked into that hospital wing as a man who had never once in his life been told no by a problem he was willing to throw money at, and for the first time he understood what it felt like to be completely powerless. He stood outside the glass window of his daughter's room and watched machines breathe for her, while doctors spoke in a language he didn't understand, a language full of words like atypical presentation and unidentified trigger, words that all meant the same terrifying thing: nobody knew what was wrong. He called in 3 additional specialists from out of state within the first night alone. He offered to fly in a team from a research hospital 2 states over. None of it mattered, because the one thing money could not buy in that moment was time, and Claire's condition kept getting worse with every passing hour. Back at the house, the staff whispered about what had happened, the way staff always do, gathering in small clusters in the kitchen and the hallways, trading half-formed theories about what could have caused such a sudden, frightening collapse. But Maggie did not whisper. She sat alone in her small room above the garage with the lights off, running through everything she had noticed over the past few weeks: the tiredness, the rash, the loss of appetite, and a memory began forming in her mind that she had spent years trying not to think about. When she was 16, her younger brother had shown almost identical symptoms, dismissed by everyone around them as nothing serious, until the day he collapsed exactly the way Claire had. There had been no big hospital for her family back then, no team of specialists, only her grandmother and a remedy passed down through 3 generations of women who lived too far from modern medicine to rely on anything else. She remembered sitting beside her brother's bed for 2 days straight, terrified, watching her grandmother work with a calm certainty Maggie hadn't understood at the time, mixing the dried leaves with warm water and administering it slowly hour by hour, while the rest of the family prayed and waited. Her brother survived because of that remedy. He grew up, had children of his own, and to this day had no idea how close he had come to not making it. Nobody else in that rural county would have believed it could work, and nobody in the Holloway household would believe it either. Maggie spent that entire night wrestling with a decision that should not have been difficult, but felt impossible. She had just been threatened with losing her job over a misunderstanding. She had spent 11 years being mocked for the very thing she now believed could save Claire's life. If she showed up at that hospital and was wrong, she would not just be fired, she would likely be accused of something far worse: interfering with a medical emergency involving a family with more lawyers than the hospital itself. If she stayed silent and did nothing, and her instinct turned out to be right, she would have to live the rest of her life knowing she let fear keep her from trying to save someone she had grown to genuinely care about. By sunrise, she had made her decision. She packed a small jar of dried leaves into her coat pocket, the same blend her grandmother once used, and walked out the door toward a hospital that had no idea she was coming, and a family that had no reason to listen to her. Getting into that hospital wing was its own battle. Security at the private wing where Claire was being treated had strict instructions: family and approved medical personnel only, and Maggie was neither. She was turned away twice at the front desk, told to leave her information and go home, the security staff unmoved by her insistence that she needed to speak with someone, anyone, about Claire's condition. For nearly 2 hours, Maggie sat in the public waiting area of the hospital, watching the clock, wondering if she had made the trip for nothing, wondering if she should simply go home and accept that her last warning had likely already become a final dismissal. It was only because of a young intensive care nurse named Patricia Lindgren, who recognized Maggie from a previous visit to the estate, and who had quietly grown frustrated watching a medical team run out of conventional options, that Maggie was eventually allowed to wait in a side room instead of being escorted off the property entirely. Patricia had been on shift for nearly 18 hours straight by that point, watching Claire's numbers decline in increments that worried her more than she let on to the rest of the team. She had seen enough unexplained cases in her career to know that sometimes the textbook didn't have every answer, and something about the calm certainty in Maggie's voice made her willing to take a risk most of her colleagues would never have considered. Meanwhile, the medical team had brought in a renowned outside specialist, a man with decades of experience and a reputation for solving cases nobody else could crack, flown in on Richard's private jet less than 12 hours after Claire's collapse. Richard placed every ounce of remaining hope into this one doctor, certain that this was finally the answer his money had been buying him all night. The specialist ran a new round of tests, proposed an aggressive treatment plan, and for a brief moment the family allowed themselves to believe the worst was over. Richard even allowed himself a few hours of sleep in a hospital chair for the first time since the collapse, convinced the right person had finally arrived. Within hours, Claire's condition did not improve, it worsened, her vitals dropping into territory that made the entire care team visibly tense in a way they had been careful to hide until then. The aggressive treatment plan, designed around an assumption that turned out to be wrong, had pushed her body further into distress rather than pulling it back. The one option Richard had trusted most had failed, and for the first time since landing back in the city, he sat down in a hallway chair and put his head in his hands, completely out of ideas, watching the team scramble to undo the damage of a treatment that had been his last remaining hope. It was Patricia who finally brought Maggie's name to Richard carefully, knowing exactly how it would sound to a man who had just watched a celebrated specialist fail his daughter. She told him there was someone outside who believed she knew what was happening, someone with no medical degree and no credentials, only a memory from her childhood and a small jar of dried leaves. Richard's first instinct was disbelief bordering on anger, the same instinct that had let his own staff mock this woman for 11 years without him ever questioning it. He nearly dismissed the suggestion outright, exhausted and frightened, and in no mood to entertain what sounded, on its surface, like exactly the kind of unproven nonsense he had spent his entire career avoiding. But desperation has a way of stripping away pride faster than anything else, and somewhere underneath his exhaustion was a father who would have tried absolutely anything at that point. He thought about Claire as a little girl before her mother passed, before the company consumed every spare hour of his life, and he thought about how little he had actually been present for in the years since. He agreed to hear Maggie out on one condition, that everything she suggested be reviewed and supervised by the medical team before anyone acted on it. Maggie sat across from Richard Holloway for the first time in 11 years as an equal rather than an employee, and she explained, calmly and without apology, what she believed was happening to his daughter. She described her brother's illness from decades earlier, the symptoms that matched almost exactly, and the remedy her grandmother had used that no modern test had ever been designed to detect, because it came from a condition rural doctors back then had learned to recognize through generations of observation rather than laboratory science. She did not raise her voice, did not plead, simply laid out what she knew with the same quiet steadiness she had carried through 11 years of being overlooked. The hospital's senior physician, skeptical but cornered by a patient who was running out of time and out of options, agreed to examine the remedy, cross-check its components against Claire's symptoms and blood work, and if there was no medical reason to believe it would cause harm, allow it to be administered under full supervision as a last resort. It took nearly 2 more hours of internal debate among the medical team before that approval came through, 2 hours during which Claire's numbers continued their slow, frightening decline, and during which Richard stood at his daughter's bedside, gripping her hand, finally allowing himself to consider an option he never would have entertained a single day earlier. What followed was the longest hour of Richard Holloway's life. Maggie prepared the remedy exactly as her grandmother had taught her decades earlier, under the watchful eyes of doctors who had never seen anything like it, and who fully expected to be proven right that this was nothing more than a desperate woman's superstition. The remedy was administered slowly, carefully, with every vital sign monitored in real time, the senior physician standing close enough to intervene the instant anything looked wrong. For the first 20 minutes, nothing changed. Richard stood at the foot of his daughter's bed, gripping the rail so tightly his knuckles went white, watching the same monitors he had been staring at for nearly 2 full days. Patricia stood near the door, watching just as closely, hoping she hadn't made a terrible mistake by bringing Maggie into that room in the first place. The silence in the room stretched on, heavy and unbearable, every second feeling longer than the last. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, Claire's numbers began to shift. Her breathing steadied. Her colour started to return. The inflammation markers that had confused every specialist for nearly 2 days began, slowly, to move in the right direction. By the time the hour was over, the senior physician, a man who had built his entire career on skepticism toward anything outside a textbook, stood in stunned silence at the foot of the bed, staring at vital signs that, 20 minutes earlier, nobody in that room believed were possible. He would later admit, in a quiet conversation with Richard days afterward, that in 30 years of practicing medicine, he had never seen anything quite like what happened in that room, and that it had fundamentally changed how he thought about the limits of what modern medicine actually understood. Claire's eyes opened just before dawn, groggy and disoriented, but undeniably present, her gaze finding her father's face first, then drifting to Maggie standing quietly near the window. She didn't fully understand yet what had happened, but she understood enough to reach for Maggie's hand before her father's, a small gesture that told Richard everything he needed to know about how deeply this woman had mattered to his daughter long before this night, and how badly his household had failed to see it. In the weeks that followed, Claire made a full recovery. And the story of what happened in that hospital room spread through the Holloway household far faster than any of the polite, professional explanations the family tried to offer at first. Richard did not simply thank Maggie. He sat down with her personally and asked her to tell him everything: her childhood, her brother, the years she had spent being dismissed by people who never once asked her a real question about who she was or what she knew. He apologized, not with a vague gesture, but by making real changes, removing the staff members who had mocked her for over a decade and ensuring nobody in that household would ever again treat the people who worked there as invisible. Maggie was offered a permanent, secure position in the family's life, not as a maid, but as someone whose knowledge had quite literally been the difference between life and death. Richard helped her connect with the hospital's research department, where doctors who had once dismissed her remedy outright now wanted to understand it, to document it, to study what generations of women in her family had quietly known long before any of them had a medical license. Claire never forgot the conversations she used to have with Maggie in that kitchen, conversations everyone else dismissed as a young woman humoring the help, and she made sure, for the rest of her life, that she never again underestimated someone simply because of the uniform they wore or the job title they carried. Patricia Lindgren, the nurse who had taken the first quiet risk that made everything else possible, became a lasting friend to both Maggie and the Holloway family, and she would later say that the moment she let Maggie into that side room was the single best decision of her entire nursing career. The woman an entire household once laughed at became the reason a family was still whole, and somewhere in that mansion, the jar of dried leaves that used to sit mocked and ignored in an apron pocket now sits framed on a shelf, a quiet reminder that the people we overlook the most are sometimes the ones standing closest to the answer. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, let us know where you are watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one.